Welcome back to the Flow Performance Podcast. My name is Ricky Dan, founder of Flow Nutrition and your host. On today's episode, I had the pleasure of chatting with PhD candidate and a good mate of mine, Alec McKenzie. And we answer this week's question, what's the go with shoulder injuries, particularly in swimming and surfing? Alec has a Bachelor of Clinical Science, a Master's of Science, and is currently completing his PhD in Exercise Science at Griffith University. On top of this, he is also a QAS scholar and an academic teacher in anatomy and physiology at Southern Cross University. Alec's PhD is specifically looking at shoulder injuries in competitive swimmers, and this is predominantly stemming from his own extensive background as a swimmer, which includes being coached by the top Aussie coach Michael Bohl, and over 7 years' experience at a high level as a competitive water polo player. If it wasn't for a shoulder injury of his own at 18 that forced him out of the pool, and I'm quoting him here, he would have been a dual Olympian. Most recently though, Alec is a mad keen surfer, and he's also been a big part of my PhD as a co-author and also as a surfing participant in my main case study. In this chat, Alec explains an overview of his PhD, the similarities between the swimming stroke and the paddling action in surfing. We discuss how swimmers and surfers can reduce the likelihood of shoulder injuries and what surfers can learn from the available research in swimming. So if you find this episode valuable, don't hesitate to drop it a 5-star rating, share it with a mate, or post it up on your Instagram story and tag the Flow Performance Podcast. So let's dive into it. What's the go with shoulder injuries with Alec McKenzie? Welcome back to the Flow Performance Podcast. My name is Ricky Dan, founder of Flow Nutrition and your host. Today I'm out at Southern Cross University with Alec McKenzie. Mate, great to have you on.
Great to be here and welcome you to my lovely lab.
This is beautiful. For those who haven't been out to Southern Cross University, we're on level 10 and it is freaking stunning. You can see the Coolangatta Airport, Kira,
Mount Warning on one side, Perfect Barrels, Kira at the other.
Bloody hell. I don't know how you get any work done in here. It is beautiful. So let's dive straight into today's question. And today's question is around what's the go with shoulder injury PhDs, essentially, because that's what your PhD is on. There was a little intro before this where I did explain your background and what you've done, so they will be familiar. You are doing a PhD in shoulder injuries, particularly in swimmers. But we also know this is somewhat applicable not just to swimmers, but maybe with surfing and paddling and just shoulder injuries in general. So maybe let's start with a brief overview of what your PhD is about.
Righto, my PhD is in collaboration with Swimming Australia, the Queensland Academy of Sport and Griffith University. And essentially my job is to predict, so who's at risk, high risk of shoulder injury, and then hopefully, how do we prevent it?
Epic. That's a really good, succinct explanation, because that's something that when people ask me what my PhD is on, I struggle to just give them a simple answer. But we are talking to the 3-minute thesis winner over here. So
People's champion. Yep.
The people's champion. He can explain complex things very simply. Maybe let's start with what is defined, what is the shoulder? What do you classify as the structures, the muscles? What are we talking about the shoulder?
Right. Oh, I wasn't expecting that question. Yeah, shoulder's a bit of an interesting one. You think it's just, that thing, but it's, you can't see, but yeah, there's actually multiple joints involved and it's really mobile. It's your most mobile joint in your body, which inherently makes it the most unstable. So the reason you can put your arm up in a full circle, the mobility is at the cost of stability, which is good for getting around and good so we can swim, we can paddle, we can reach up high, but bad because we can dislocate it quite easily relative to somewhere like a hip or a knee.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so when we look at swimming, which your PhD is particularly on, I'm guessing, I know a little bit about your PhD already, but what comes to mind is probably just overuse injuries just because they're doing so many strokes. Bit of a weird question to start, but is there any comparison or do we know how many paddles surfers do in the ocean?
Yeah, so it's pretty hard to compare because in swimming, it's really easy to count strokes. You might do 25 to 30 strokes a lap and how many laps you're doing in a day. But in surfing, it's a lot harder because a lot of times you're paddling on the spot. So they do call it a time motion analysis. So if you're in the water for an hour surfing, you might be paddling for 45 minutes, but you might not be going anywhere. Like, if there's a big sweep at snapper, you got to paddle just to stay in spot. So it's pretty hard to compare. Swimmers, the elite swimmers we work with, there's no doubt they swim more. They do more shoulder revolutions or more strokes than a surfer will. They do about 50 to 60 kilometers a week, which is just insane.
That is cooked.
Yeah. So here's one. One of my supervisors, she was a Com Games medalist for the 100-meter hurdles. So 100-meter hurdles, guess how far she would run in a week?
Oh, geez. I can't even... In a week, I wouldn't think much at all. I'd think maybe... Oh, Jesus. I've never even thought about that, what sprinters would do. I'm going to say 20 Ks, because I reckon there'd be some sort of conditioning stuff where they go for like 5K runs, but the rest would be short, sharp. I'm going to say 20.
Yeah, well, no. She reckons 5 to 10K. Absolute maximum would be 10K. Yeah, so a quarter of a marathon a week. Yeah. 100-meter freestyler on average. Guess what they'd swim? So swimming marathon is 10 Ks.
Yeah, well, you just said they're upward of like, I don't want to know. I'd say 2.
Yeah, so a 100-meter might go 45 to 50 Ks, which is 4.5, 5 marathons a week equivalent. Whereas in running, you might do a quarter of a marathon.
Why?
It's just how it's developed. It's starting to turn. They say we've got a sprint revolution on our hands at the moment. Yeah. Cam McAvoy, he's just reinvented the wheel basically for sprint training, and a few others are following his lead. But yeah, it's just the way they do it.
Because, I've got no experience whatsoever in swimming or track and field sprinting stuff. Like, I've got a bit of long endurance event sort of experience, but like, what's the difference between upper and lower body for the same distance? Like, why is that so drastically...
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. It's just the way they've done it, the way they've always done it. Swimming is a sport where on a bad day, if you're not feeling the water right, you lose your efficiency. Whereas running, you're always running at, 90% efficiency. You push a little bit up, but mostly you push out. So you lose a little bit of efficiency pointing up. But then in swimming, there's nothing to really grip onto. So your hand can feel like at least it's slipping through the water as opposed to grabbing the water and pulling yourself through. So, yeah, they say you can't really have a day off in swimming because you lose the hand-water connection.
Yeah, wow. So, touching back on the PhD, so for those who aren't aware of what a PhD is, it's essentially a collection of little research papers that you end up hopefully publishing. What are your sort of foundational research questions or the papers that you're hoping to publish?
Okay, so we know almost all swimmers get a shoulder injury. We even see almost every Olympics, 4 or 5 elite guys, they might have just won a gold medal, they retired due to shoulder pain. So first study on my PhD is going to look at these people 10, 15 years after retiring. So we're going to interview and do some shoulder assessments on retired Olympic swimmers to see how long these shoulder injuries last. That'll just help us define how big of a problem is this, how much of an effort do we need to put into preventing these injuries. The second 2 studies, so studies 2 and 3, we'll ask the question, what causes shoulder injuries in swimmers? So we'll ask the literature, so what are researchers, what's been published, what do we think causes injuries? We'll also ask experts, what do they think causes injuries? And we'll look for overlap between those 2 studies. Once we know what the literature and the experts think cause shoulder injuries, then we're going to validate it, check that they do. So we do a long-term study for a year. We measure all these things, all these different risk factors in competitive swimmers and see if any of them predict shoulder injury. So if this type of weakness, this type of range of motion is lower, do those people go on to get injured? And then the final study will be taking a deep dive into the actual tissue properties. So we're going to use ultrasound, it's a fancy ultrasound called shear wave elastography and velocity. And we can look at the particularly supraspinatus, a rotator cuff muscle, the tendon. Everyone gets a supraspinatus tendinopathy or tendon pain, rotator cuff. They might tear their rotator cuff. We're trying to develop a way to quantify the tissue recovery. So rather than getting a Whoop score saying you're at 80% recovery based on your heart rate, we're going to do this ultrasound and say your tissue is at 80% of its maximum or 100% of maximum. So this week you can train hard, or this week you got to take it easy. Get your tissue some time to recover.
That is an epic summary. That is a much better summary that I can do of all my research papers, all the ones that I've published, all those Dan et al.'s out there. So what do we currently know in the literature? So obviously in a PhD, the first year is just collating and collecting all of the research we currently know. What essentially do we know in the research at the moment?
Yeah, so not just the research, but if we look at expert opinion as well. First study was just, this is what the researcher thinks. This is what the research thinks. And what we found was we weren't confident with we weren't 100% sure that this is true. Because the studies, it's really hard to control things in performance sport. And if you can't control it, you can't be confident of the result. So that's why we asked expert opinion as well. And we combined, see where there's overlap. And where there's overlap, so experts think this thing is really important and there's research there to support it. First and foremost is training load. So how much you're moving your shoulder. And like I said, swimmers swim too much. Surfers, probably the same. Second most important is actually inconsistent training load. So it's not high absolute load. It's not the amount of strokes you do per week. It's if you do 1,000 strokes one week, 50 strokes the next week, and then 1,000 strokes again. It's that inconsistency, which we know that tendons get hurt when they're inconsistently loaded. More swimming specific, the first modifiable one, so the first one we can do something about from a strength training perspective at least, is what we call posterior shoulder strength endurance. So you're seeing people everyone's seen people doing these external rotations on the elastic bands. So the reason they do that, this is the thought at least, again, we're not confident this is 100% true, but as you're swimming, as you're paddling, you're doing lots of forceful internal rotation. So you might see swimmers and surfers clumped over with rounded shoulders like that, like you are right now.
Yeah, currently sitting right now, yeah.
Yeah, so the thought is you got really strong muscles on one side and you got weak muscles on the other side. May make your shoulder bone, the humerus, to sit in a bad spot, pinch things and get hurt. So the thought is the stronger, not necessarily the stronger, not maximal strength, but strength endurance. So how many times can you do an 80% load is really important, just to help center that humeral head, keep our ball and socket joint, which is our shoulder joint, intact.
That's epic. Can we just touch on those first two there? Because I think that inconsistent load and just the overall training load, when you were saying that, I was just scared, because when you think of surfing and how the general surfing behaviors are, it's when the swell period comes, you can go from nothing to surfing every day for 2 weeks. And I had a really good chat with Cohen, the S&C coach from Surfing Australia, about how to deal with inconsistent training loads with surfers that are even on the world tour. Do you have any advice for surfers if there's a big period of no swell, which we're currently experiencing for let's say 2 or 3 weeks? Should they be jumping in the water and swimming or paddling, taking their board in the pool? How can we combat that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and one I'd love to do some research on. We know that shoulder, if we look at non-contact injuries, so the most common injuries in surfing are cuts and bruises from reef, surfboards, other people, blah, blah, blah. Can't do much to avoid them. Next most common is a traumatic injury of, say, the ankle. When you do an air, especially competitive, do an air, land wrong, bust your ankle or your knee. If we look at non-contact injuries, these are probably stuff that we can really do something about. It goes lower back, which, because you're always in that banana back position, hyperextended, lower back's going to get sore, and then the shoulder. So shoulder is the second most prevalent injury, second most prevalent non-contact injury. There we go, got it. Okay, so, and then like you say, we got a flat period now. We might be flat for 2 weeks, might get one surf in 2 weeks. And then a big swell comes through and you'll surf for 4 hours a day for a week straight. So it's my opinion, we don't have the research, but we know that tendons don't like inconsistency. And yeah, surfing is a sport that's born out of inconsistency. It's not good all the time. So you paddle lots one week, you don't paddle at all the next week. So if it was me, just keep in the gym. And I'd really love to introduce a swimming intervention. So swimming is really important in surfing. It's basically the same stroke, a little bit different, but basically the same. If you can do some swimming training when the water's flat, you'll be a better paddler, more efficient, so you can take less strokes throughout your surf, and you're loading that shoulder, giving it a bit of consistency, potentially reducing your risk of injury.
Love that. Bit of a weird question, but how specific does it need to be to paddling and surfing? Like if I'm someone who's also going to the gym, doing some shoulder press, doing some bicep curls, of course, or maybe even playing Wednesday night tennis fixtures or doing some sort of other upper body exercise where you're putting the shoulder through range, would that classify as putting load through the shoulder, or how specific would it need to be to paddling?
Yeah, well, that's the next big question. We don't actually have a good way to quantify shoulder loads. So you've got so many muscles in the shoulder, and you can do it at so many different vectors, so many different joint angles, that yes, it does need to be specific. You do need to be specifically loading the specific tendon. So supraspinatus tendon, you need to load that tendon. Do you think the tendon cares what position you're in when you're doing it? Probably not. But to load it, you probably need to be in a similar position. And I think you definitely need to be getting overhead given the nature of swimming and paddling.
No, that's very helpful. One question that I'd love to get your thoughts on, it's around the cool thing about your PhD is you've got a really good understanding of the literature, and you've also spoken with a lot of the coaches and the athletes. So in your opinion, and you may have already, or you're in the middle of publishing research and the findings of this, but is there agreement? Is there agreement between what the literature says and what the coaches are implementing, or what the athletes think? Is there disagreement? What are your sort of findings around that?
Yeah, great question. That's what the paper will be hopefully submitting next week. There is obviously some agreement, but yeah, there is a lot of disagreement as well, which we would call an evidence-practice gap. The main disagreement is a lot of coaches think absolute strength is important. So your maximal lift is important for your shoulder health.
And what does that mean? Is that how much I can bench press or pull up?
Yeah, so whatever it happens to be, yep. Bench press, pull up, maximal external rotation strength, whatever it is. Coaches, particularly strength coaches, as you'd expect, think your maximal strength is super, super important. Whereas actually in the literature, no study has found an association between maximal strength and shoulder injury in swimmers at least. And you think about it, in swimming and paddling, you're never maximally doing a maximal as hard as you can, absolute maximal strength range of... Yeah. But you are doing it consistently for an hour and a half, 2 hours at a time. So that's why
which is why training mode, you would think, right, is going to be more of a...
And strength endurance. So rather than what's your maximal weight you can pull, at 80%, how many times can you do it?
Do you know, I know Ollie Farley did he published some stuff around, the percentage we're paddling during, but do you know the percentages of how much is like maximal paddling versus just cruising? Do you know those stats off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Yeah, because the majority would be just like keeping yourself in position, duck diving, maintaining position. It'd be a very small amount that's actually explosive, right?
Yeah, and even your absolute most explosive paddle, you're still not reaching 100% of your muscle force, are you?
Yeah. Yeah.
You might be reaching 70, 80% at most.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So keep strength training, but just track training load, don't overdo it, and possibly when there's a flat spell, go and do something with your shoulders.
Yeah. And
that's sort of the summary from that.
Yeah, and there's one other thing you need to touch on, range of motion, stretching. Mm-hmm. A lot of coaches think that's really important. Again, in the literature, there's no study that said that's associated with shoulder injury. So probably has nothing to do with shoulder injury. If it's changing, yes, but if you're paddling regularly, your range of motion is going to be fine to paddle. You're going to adapt to it.
Yeah, epic. Amazing, mate. That's an unreal summary of your PhD there. Thank you very much for your insight. If anyone has any further questions, don't hesitate to shoot us a message at Flow Nutrition with an _ on Instagram, or you can hit Alec up directly. You can shoot him an email, alec.mckenzie@griffith.edu.au, and he's got some publications on the way. He's already got how many under your belt?
Just got one yesterday. Well, hopefully published today. I think that's a 6.
Yep. And we've currently got one we're working on together, the concept mapping one, which is...
submit next week. Well, it's ready for submission, actually.
How good. So there's some exciting shoulder injury research on the way. So we, once again, will notify you all on when all that stuff comes out. We love keeping in the loop with the latest research. So, mate, love the work you're doing. Love the research. And, yeah, listeners, we will catch you again next week to answer more of your questions. Thanks, Alec.
Let's go for a paddle.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Flow Performance Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the chat and found loads of value that you can use to fuel more flow state in your life. If you did enjoy the content and want to support the podcast, don't forget to give it a 5-star rating, leave a review, or even better, share it to a mate, post it up on your Instagram story and tag Flow Performance Podcast. We really do appreciate any support in getting this content out into the world. So thanks again for tuning in, and we will catch you again next week.